welcome back to the second session of this morning. And the good news is we managed to, despite some small obstacles, we managed to arrange lunch, which is ready. So after the lecture, there will be food in the registration room. And an even better news, we're about to listen to Fabian Schang talking to us about the structural semantics for multimodal oppositions.
How many times do I have?
You have 40 minutes.
40 minutes. Okay, I have to be clear. So thanks again. So the general plan of my presentation is the following one. So with 4 different parts, the general plan of my presentation has to do with the relation between meaning and logical form in general. So what is exactly the relation between the contribution of logical form to the meaning of different statements in general? That's the point. It's a structural approach of meaning in this case. So the first part, I would like to have some notes about the relation between meaning, information. So what meaning of information, for instance, is a very, very broad question, of course. I just want to have a sketchy approach of the meaning of information. So just imagine you have proposition P. So we can say an affirmation is about the truth of P or the falsity of P. It's something like an information. But another information, and deductive information, so to say, is given the truth of P or given the falsity of P, I should know that something can be inferred from the truth and the falsity of P. So the relation between P and different propositions is another sort of information. It has to do with the deductive relations between propositions and some other ones. And the relation between propositions in a given set is the problem I want to approach in this general talk. So the question is, given one proposition, so how is the letter related to the other ones in one the same model? That's the meaning, I guess, I want to give to the meaning of information in this program. So we can, for instance, we can have 2 different sorts of information between different sets of propositions. So I borrow this different classification of informations from a paper from Domain Smeth's very recent forthcoming paper. In this paper, it says that we can have something like implicational relations or oppositional relations between propositions. So the implicational means that we want to propagate truth. So these are, sorry, yes, I have to master this. Yeah, so R1 is a truth propagation relations. That say you have, for instance, a proposition phi. So can we propagate the truth from phi or not? And incompatibility or compatibility is another set of informations. You have two different sets of informations. This has to do with the very famous Aristotle's square of opposition, of course. And this has to do with the classical relation of consequence between different sets. But these 2 sorts of relations are 2 different sorts of information, not the same. So how different are propositions to be? In general, we can have, of course, a basic 2 partition between compatible and incompatible propositions. We have model, and different propositions are supposed to be consistent with each other in one and the same model, so they're supposed to be compatible. And whenever we say that, for instance, we have incompatible relation between 2 propositions, it's supposed to be that we accept one proposition in the model, but we cannot accept the other one because of the incompatible relation between both. It's another sort of information you can give between 2 different propositions. So now the question is, just imagine you have a proposition, you have another proposition, how to determine the relation between both propositions. So a very classical way of determining the relation between 2 propositions is by restricting the set of bivalent propositions. So it's a very classical bivalent way of determining the relation between both. You have, just imagine you have here a set of different 2 values assignments. So we say order assignment. You have TT. It means that P is true and Q is true, P is true and Q is false, etc. It's just a very classical truth value assignment of propositions. And given this sort of classification, you can, of course, have that which you already know, that's a different relation of oppositional relations between propositions. So, for instance, you say that 2 propositions are contradictory with each other. When you have this restricted set of true value assignments, so if you have P being true, Q has to be false, and conversely, in order for the 2 propositions to be contradictory to each other. Contrariety is a different set of constraints, because in this case the constraints are weaker than the contradiction, because 2 related propositions can be contrary to each other by being both false but not both being true. you know that, of course, we get just a classification of different sort of information between propositions. So contrariety is something like the reflect mirror of contrariety, because in this case, both propositions can be true together. So this has to do with oppositional constraint here. So we have a constraint, because here, this gray true value assignments cannot be given if you have contradiction, contrariety, and subcontrariety. And if you don't have any constraint about the oppositional relations, in this case you have something like to be called non-contradiction. What does it mean? P and its relative proposition can be true together or false together. We have no constraint. In this case, you have absolutely no restriction upon the set of true value assignment. Call this non-contradiction or give another name. However, if you have just oppositional relations, and with implicational constraints, in this case, we have equivalence, subalternation, and superalternation. So here, as you can see, subalternation is placed as a relation about the implicational constraints. It's very classical to say that in Aristotle's square we have contrariety, subcontrariety, contradiction, and subalternation. But subalternation is not an oppositional relation. It's an implicational relation, because with subalternation, say, whenever you have the truth of the first term, you have to give the truth to the second term. It's something like an implicational constraint. This means that the Aristotelian square conflates two sorts of information about opposition and about implication. So the square is something like a mix of two different sorts of information between propositions. Now, if you don't have any constraint upon the implicational relation between propositions, in this case you have independence. So I would like to return about this term because it's very important. What does it mean, independence? Independence is not the same as non-contradiction. Non-contradiction, you can have every true value assignment you please with regard to the question about the oppositional constraint. And we have the same result here, but the constraint is not about the same sort of relation. It means, do you have to give a specific true value according to the value of the first proposition or not? You have exactly the same result here and there, but not some sort of relation. Opposition here, implication there. Okay, it's just a quick classification. Now, another question is, when is an information relevant? So we can say, for instance, tautologies are not very relevant as a sort of information, or we can say, for instance, if you have the truth of P, if you know that P is true, some other sorts of information are not very relevant with respect to the truth of P. So, in a general model, you say that contradiction is enough in order to have relevant information about a model, for instance. You say P is true, it's relevant for you to say that P, not P, is negation of P, is not true. It's enough. What about the contrariety, for instance? What about the contrary of P? Is there a contrary of P in this case? No, there is no contrary of P because of the logical complexity, the logical form of P. But now the question is, which sort of information do you need in order to have a relevant set, a relevant model of propositions? Contradiction is supposed to be enough because you have just consistent set of propositions, and whatever is inconsistent with the set of propositions cannot be accepted at the same time. That's all. Contradiction is supposed to be enough. Now, if you want to apply negation as a way to make a difference between the consistent set of propositions and something inconsistent with the first set, you say, okay, you apply negation. Here we have two sorts of negation. So we say, for instance, here we have an information, either P or Q is true. You can say, of course, that this is incompatible with this negation, but not that one. Because it's here, as you can see, of course, intuitively or just by very classical bivalent computation, you can say that this application of negation doesn't make this proposition inconsistent with this one. But this proposition is inconsistent with this one. The question is why? How to determine a mechanical way of determining the relation, the information of one proposition according to the value of first one. So here, two different negations even entail incompatibility between propositions, of course, because here we have one negation. This is incompatible with P or Q, and this is not incompatible with, this is compatible with this one, but not that one, okay? One negation, not the same place. It means that according to the place in which you apply negation, we don't have the same sort of information. Of course, here we have the very, the classical, this is the external negation. Here we have something like an internal negation. So I would like to make use afterwards of this difference, this syntactical difference between external and internal negation, in order to make sense of the relation between different informations. So, another one question is how to determine such basic logical relation between any two propositions. Just imagine you have any two propositions you want. How to determine the relation between both mechanically? By means of their true values, of course. If you are able to give true value assignments, to apply true values to propositions, you are supposed to be able to give the relation between the two propositions according to their being true or false at the same time. Another way to determine the relation between two propositions is according to their logical form. Think about the difference between internal and external negation. This has to do with the logical form of propositions, not the semantic value, in the sense that we don't speak about truth and falsity whenever you talk about the logical form. And this talk, I would like to emphasize about the relevance of logical form in order to define the relation between different propositions. That's the point. And here, the relation between different propositions hold in every model. Not in this case. By means of true values, you can say, for instance, that a proposition is true in a model and false in another one. But if you want to define exactly the relation between propositions by means of their logical form, this has supposed to mean to hold in every model in this case. And this is the problem I want to approach in the following slides. So, in a nutshell, we can say that the meaning is something like a partition on information. So we say, for instance, if you want to give an information, say this is true, and something else is false. In this case, you make something like a borderline between two sets of propositions. This is supposed to be true in a model, and it's supposed to be false to be outside the model. So the difference between truth and falsity is supposed to be a very semantic basic information between different propositions. Now, do we have only two different sets of information, or can we have more than two sets of information between propositions? Just the true sentences and the false ones, or something else, something more than the dichotomy between truth and falsity? That's the question. If you want to apply it to theory of opposition, you can have more than just a dichotomy between truth and falsity. That's the point. There can be several ways for information, a sentence or a set of sentences. There can be different ways of being true and false, or to be accepted and rejected. You can accept something strongly, weakly. You can reject strongly and weakly. Now, what's the meaning of being accepted or rejecting strongly and weakly? What's the meaning of introducing shades between different sets of information, let's say? In a sense, you can say that a proposition that's supposed to be contrary is strongly false with respect to a merely contradictory sentence, so to say. But I have to explain exactly the meaning of being false strongly and weakly. So, just imagine, I know that this proposition is true. I know this is true, but I don't know exactly which one of P and Q is true. So for me, it's enough to know either that not P or not Q. It's enough. If I know that P is false, if I know that Q is false, it's enough for me to know that the other disjunct is true. That's enough. But now imagine that P and Q are both false. It's another additional information. Because you say, in this case, both members of the complex statement are both false. It's something else. It's something stronger than the first information, according to which you know that at least one of the two different disjuncts are false. It's another information here. So in epistemic logic, for instance, you have a two-fold partition between contradictory states of affairs. If you know that something is true, for instance, you can make a partition between the set of propositions that entail from the first one, or that don't entail for the first one. In this case, we have something like a partition about sets of informations. It's enough. Contradiction is supposed to be enough in order to make a difference between what is relevantly true or relevantly false. But if you want to apply a theory of opposition, you have something more. It's a multi-set of informations, so to say. That's the reason why I want to say that an oppositional view of information is something about the nature of information, not the relevance. If you say that something is contrary, it's enough for you, if you want to have a theory of action, it's enough for you to say this is contradictory with the first sentence. So I cannot act according to the second information because this is contradictory with the first one. I accept the truth. Now, if you say that something is contrary, it's richer. You say, okay, I just want a theory of action. I don't take contradictory, contrariety into account, because for me it's just an additional set of information I can be deprived of. But here it's about the nature of information, not about the relevance. So just imagine information is now something to do with the structure of the statement. We have the structure. The structure means that you have different combinations between different subsets in a statement, and you have to combine different information into only one. And the combination between different informations give rise in another set of information. So if you want to speak about information just in terms of truth and falsity, you have a semantic partition. This is a set of true informations and a set of false informations. You have just a borderline between what you can accept and what you reject. Now, if you have something between affirmation and denial, this is a syntactic partition. Because here, it's not a question about truth and falsity, it's a question about the negation you apply to one component of a structured statement. That's the point here. And I would like to emphasize about the way to determine the meaning or the information you have in a set of statements according to this sort of information, not that one. I would like to take a part of this sort of very classical approach of information and to emphasize about this one. So, the title of my paper is about multimodalities. So I have to be clear about the meaning of multimodalities, because multimodality is supposed to be something about epistemic, deontic, temporal logic, so to say. It will be the case that I know that's obligatory that P, for instance. In this case, we have a combination of different modal operators, but the meaning I would like to give to multimodalities here is broader. I borrowed my definition of multimodalities from a paper of Van Vliet from 51. It's modal logics. Van Vliet introduced or included quantifiers in the set of different modal operators. So we have this different definition by Van Vliet. Van Vliet said we have two sorts of categories of logical concepts. You have truth logic or truth operators, and modal logic, modal operators. So truth logic has to do with truth and falsity, whereas the modal operators has to do with the modes of being true or being false. So of course we know that. I just want to recall in order to be very clear on the meaning I attach to multimodalities here. So the result of such a distinction between truth operators on the one hand and modal operators on the other hand give rise to such a classification of different modi. So alectic, epistemic, deontic, and existential. So existential quantifiers, a universal or a particular existential quantifiers are supposed to be modal operators here, because it's a way to say that something is true. Something is true because it's known, something is true because it will be the case, so different modes have been true in here. Van Vliet assumed existential quantifiers to be modal operators. In this sense of modalities, I would like to construct a theory of multimodal opposed statements. And here, of course, we have necessary, verified, null, obligatory, and maybe in quantification, what's the meaning, what's the counterpart of this stronger operators, for instance. If you can say that the counterpart, the quantified counterpart of necessary is for every individual x, the counterpart of possibility for some. So it's just the analogy between quantifiers and modal operators, something very classical, you know that. I just want to recall this general classification. And here is the Dedicto and Duret mode. I would like to return about this point because I will have to present a different classification of oppositions by Buridan in a couple of slides. Okay, on this screen you are supposed to be very familiar with this. So here we have different sorts of multimodal statements. Here, for instance, it's necessary possible. It's necessary that it will be the case that I know that P, or there is an X such as X is P and X is Q. It's supposed to be a modal statement according to Van Vliet's definition of modal operators, modes of being true. So now the question is, how many components are there in the statement, this quantifier statement? Because I say that the logical structure of a statement determines the set of information you have. So you have to be very clear about the number of components of the statement in order to define the meaning of the statement. So I will say that there is 5 different components, or maybe 4, maybe 3, maybe 2, or maybe 1. If you say, for instance, that this statement has only one set of information, this means that you cannot decompose these statements, it would just have the truth of the falsity. Of course, it's very weak, too weak, so to say. So we have to say that this is not sufficient in order to give a clear analysis of the meaning of these statements. We have to say something more. So just imagine you have a one array function and you want to go to an n array function. You have 1 to n, with n is just an integer beyond a unary function. So in this case, you say that connective, for instance, P and Q, P or Q, or if P and Q, it's another information in supplement in addition with the modal operators. Because connective are supposed to be truth operators, according to von Vlecht classification, whereas the modal operators are something else. So we just have, the result is just a function argument analysis of multimodalities. So a multimodality is something like this. You have phi is a structural statement, and phi has this general logical form, in which f is a modal operator, it's a function, and x is a set of arguments. And this operator applies, maps onto the set of arguments. It's a very general logical form. And in this case, of course, a very interesting point is, just imagine if you have more than only one function. What happens? What happens if you have, for instance, three functions, three nested functions? How to determine the meaning of the whole according to the number of functions you have? Because n is not just one; it's from one to any natural number you have beyond a unary function in this case. So duality has to be defined in terms of negation here, because if you apply double negation upon the f prime, for instance, he has said this different of modality in terms of f and f prime. Okay, and in this case we can say that since what's the point of this operator? This operator is supposed to be nil, the nil operator. It's true that, let's say. So this is something like a nil operator. So if you want to apply this negation here and there, of course there is the same result here and there, because it's supposed to be a case in which f equals 0. It's a nil or a zero function. This function is supposed to be a borderline function. Otherwise, you have a modal function in the sense that we have only at least one function applying to a set of arguments, x here. Okay? So it's the general form, theoretical form I have in all the paper, all the program is this one. Okay? With f can be more than one. So, if you have, for instance, n arguments, if you have two arguments with binary connective, for instance, P and Q, you have two arguments. You can apply negation upon P and Q separately. But at the same time, you can say we want to apply only one negation. You just want to apply negation on the whole connection, on the whole conjunction or not. If, of course, if you want to apply only one negation, you have less information in the end. If you want to apply negation separately, you can have more than one information as a sort of incompatible relation. So it's very important to explain exactly upon how many members or how many components you can apply negation in order to classify the different sets of informations in a set of logical forms. Okay. Now about negation, I would like to say something just very sketchy. Here, this sign is supposed to be the tilde, the classical negation. Okay, you apply this negation upon truth. You have the falsity or falsity and truth. Here is different. Here's a proto-negation. In the sense that this sign is supposed to be a syntactic one. You just apply negation upon one component of a logical form. Okay. So, for instance, you say it's the case that no, I know that P. You can apply negation either to K, the K operator, the modal operator, or both upon P. You have two different negations. In both cases, you have something called proto-negation. It's just a syntactic operator. Okay? Don't think about truth and falsity in this case, just something syntactic. And in this case, you can say that if you want to apply negation both, you return into the initial affirmation. If you want to negate twice one is the same component, the result is just a mere affirmation. So we can say that the classical background is behind this sort of syntactic definition of the statements, but here truth and falsity has nothing to do with this general problem. Excuse me, how many times do we have?
Till 10, 15 past to talk, and then we switch to
okay, so 15 minutes, okay. 10 minutes, let's say. Okay. So, yeah. So, according to the logical form you have, just imagine you have, here you have no Modal operators just have a connection. Okay, you have a conjunction between P and Q. So we just have one function here applying to P and Q. So how many different negation can we apply here? If we want to apply negation separately to P and Q, of course we can have 8 different resulting negations. You have one negation here, there, or 2 negations, or 3 negations, okay, upon the different components. So here we have 8 different negations. But if you want to apply negation only upon the conjunction, if you don't want to apply negation separately to P and Q, you have less information, of course. Because in this case, you cannot say that the negation is applied to P but not Q. You have to apply negation upon the whole or to nothing. In this case, you have less information. Here you have 8 possibly different informations upon one the set initial statement. Okay? Because it's just something algebraic. You can say that we have a logical statement with this structure of n different components. You can say that we have 2 to the power of n different waveform formulas. Here we have, for instance, a structural statement with 3 components, the function and 2 arguments. If you can apply separately negation to the 3 components, you have 8 different sort of information, of course. And you can apply this general definition to every component you want, in this case, or in every logical form you want to apply. Irrespective of the meaning of the modal operator, you can apply to knowledge of future of deontic logic. It's not the point here. It just has to do with logical form. A very classical way of defining the information has to do with a disjunctive normal form. Okay? So it has to do with Schroeder's difference between the way to define a classical statement in terms of true values assignment. Okay, so we have, for instance, here, the white ball is just a connective here, and say how many different true values assignments can I have with a binary sentence. You can have 16 different true value assignments, and this has to do with the classical bivalent truth table, of course. Here. So here we have something like a fx logical form, in this case, fx. F is the connective, and x is the two sets of the set of true arguments to which connective applies, of course. So this has to do with Baudelaire semantics, and the result is this one, of course. You have 4 different questions. Are the two arguments true together, or true and false, orderly, false and true, false and false together? And of course, the syntactic pronunciation of this is, if you say that P is true, you just have the affirmation of P, or the denial of P here. It's just the syntactic pronunciation of these 2 sets of information, semantic informations. And the truth table, of course, is just that one. It's just like the 16 different connectives. But now, if you want to have a syntactic approach of information, you have at the beginning, you have just one connective and 2 arguments. So the number of different syntactic negation you have results in 8 different information. You have 16 different informations. Because here, you take into account the order of true value assignments. But if you have a syntactic approach of information, you have less information than in this matrix, in this case, of course. This has to do with, once again, it has to do with the truth table assignments, with in ambivalent framework. Now, once again, if you say that contraction, contrariety are different information upon different propositions. For instance, one proposition is contradictory or contrary or subcontrary with another one. It's a set of information between different propositions. How to determine the oppositional relation between different propositions? You can have an algebraic approach with this one. Just imagine you have a base string here. Base string means that 0, 0, just no. You say that no, these different logical statements cannot be true at the same time or cannot be false at the same time. Okay? So here, if you have this set of different calculi, you have a way to define the set of oppositional relation between different statements. It's just something algebraic. Algebraic in the sense that you have both true together or both false together or not. And according to the set of information you have contrariety, contradiction, subcontrariety, independence. Once again, here we have not the same sort of information. Just look here. You have independence. Independence means that both propositions can be true and false together, irrespective of the meaning of P or Q. But it's not subordination, it's independence, once again. Subordination is something different. Subordination means that if you have the mid of the bit string of fx and jx, it means that it results in the first term. It's not the same definition. Okay? This has to do with opposition. And this has to do with different set of information here. This has to do with the implicational information between different propositions, not the same set of informations. Once again, just something algebraic, it works. So just apply this algebraic device to the connection, for instance, connection, how to define the connection between P and Q. This is DNF, disjonctive normal form. You can say that, for instance, this DNF is contrary to this one because of the bit strings characterizing both. So this means that this proposition, complex proposition, is contrary to that one. So we have an information upon the oppositional relation between two different propositions. So this has to do with the first set of information we have between two different propositions. So now let's go further. Piaget's INSA group, just something like an algebraic group. It's something akin to the client's Viergruppen. With client Viergruppen, you have four different, it's a group theory. You have I inertia, I just identity, N is negation, R is reciprocity, and C is correlation. It's something like a syntactic device in order to apply different sort of negation. So here, what's the meaning of N, R, C? You have different proto-negations applied to the bit string. Okay? So this works, this sort of definition works so long as you have a semantic definition of the statements. Now the question is, can we have a DNF for a modal statement? For instance, I know that P. It will be the case at P. Or it's obligatory for P to be true, for instance. Can I have a DNF defining deontic, epistemic, or temporal statements? No, it's not the case because, so just examples here. It's just an algebraic device. Now the point is that if I want to reproduce the sort of oppositional information between different propositions, I can have this algebraic device. I apply here Piaget's operators, and I can say that if I apply N applying to the DNF of a proposition results in a contractual relation, contractual relations. R is either subcontrary or contrary. Here is a problem, because by applying R to the statement, I can have something compatible or incompatible, because subcontrariety is compatibility, and contrariety is incompatibility. So applying this operator gives way to two different sorts of information, compatible or incompatible information. That's a problem in order to make this algebraic device efficient. So problems are this, that one. So we have, for instance, if I want to apply reciprocity to this term, for instance, you have subcontrariety, not contrariety. This is compatible with that one. Now, if I apply R to another set of bit strings, I can have a contrary relation, not a subcontrary. What does it mean? The result of applying R to the bit string depends upon the value of the bit string. So that restricts the very efficiency of this sort of algebraic device. Another problem is that, just imagine I want to apply C upon this DNF. The result is I have identity. So what does it mean? C is supposed to be a subordination forming relation. But can I say that identity is the same as subordination? For instance, can I say that P stands into a subordination relation to himself or not? It's something like a borderline case. Problem with algebra. And another case is here, it's just Piaget's INSA group, it's just a partial restricted calculus of logical relation. So for instance, I want to apply INSA to this information. How can I have this result from this one, that one, by means of INSA operators? I can't. I can't have this information by means of that one by applying the Piaget's INSA operation. So it's a very fragmentary and unlimited algebraic device in order to define the sort of information between different propositions. So this means that algebraic is not very informational here in order to define the different relation between propositions. So that means that we need something else, that a semantic approach of information in order to define the relation between propositions. 5 minutes? Okay. So it's a very old result, but very important relevant result, because Dugunji said that it's not possible to construct a matrix in order to define the relations between modal statements, between S1 and S5. For instance, I say, I know that P, okay? How to define exactly a matrix in order to reproduce different semantic relations between KP and different epistemic relations? I can't. I can't for every modal system between S1 and S5, as proved by Dugunji in 40. What does this mean? I cannot define exactly the information between two different propositions once these propositions are modal or belong to a modal system between S1 and S5. So I need something else than a semantic approach of information in order to define the relation between propositions. So, theory of opposition maybe could be useful in order to define the relation of opposition between different statements, and by this doing, defining exactly the sort of information, the different sort of relation you can have between two propositions within modal logics, but without semantics. Okay? So to say, it's possible to apply a scalar quantification in order to simulate a semantic approach of modalities. This has been done, for example, by methods, quantified zebra, but this is very limited because here you apply just an algebraic device in order to define the meaning of S4 and S5 modal formulas. So what does it mean? I can reproduce a semantic approach, a matrix approach, in order to define the meaning of modal statements within S4 and S5, but not for weaker model systems. So it's a very limited simulation of semantic information here. It works just for S4 and S5. Not interesting, because it's too much limited. So maybe by means of logical form, I should be able to define the relation between different propositions. Okay? So I have just to be quick because I have 3 minutes. So the point was to explain exactly the motivation between my program, and here you have different operations according to which we can define the relation between informations with respect to this logical form of statements. So first, opposition can be defined by each other. We can say, for instance, subcontrarity can be defined by means of contraction and contrariety. That's the case here. The calculus is based upon logical form, and the matter statements, knowledge, tense, actions, obligations, has nothing to do with the meaning here, because it's just a question of logical form. For instance, just try to define subcontrarity and subalternation. It's possible to define this sort of information irrespective of the notion of truth and falsity. For instance, she says that Aristotle defines subcontrarities in terms of contractors of contraries, as a functional definition of subcontrarity. Okay? This is a way to define subcontrarity here. We have two different informations. You can say that here you have a relation of contrariety between the contractories of each single component of the whole statement. Okay? So what does it mean? Subcontrariety is a relation between the contractories of the contrary relations. Another way to define now subalternation is that subalternation is a contractory of the contrary. It works. If you apply the algebraic device I formally presented, you can define subalternation in terms of an iteration of two different opposite forming operators. It works. But here, you don't have exactly the same sort of relation. You have relations and functions, and here you just have functions here and there. Okay? So, just imagine here. This has to do with Engelbrechtsen's presentation of the four different propositions according to Aristotle's quantification here. Here you don't have quantifiers. You have a singular term, Socrates. Socrates is wise, unwise, not unwise, and not wise. Here we can say that we have different oppositional relations, but you don't have quantifiers here. The relation between this sort of informations has to do with the logical form. Here you have unwise. Negation is applied only to the predicate. So it's an internal negation, and here it's an external negation. Okay? So that's the one. So here is a syntactic presentation of different informations. One protonegation applying upon x, 1 and 2 here, applying to both the function and both the arguments. So just a way to say that subalternation is something like a double negation, double protonegation applied to the function and the arguments. Okay? It's just a syntactic approach. Here you say that the fx, this is the contrary of fx because you apply a protonegation just once, and here is the subalternation because you have the contractory of the contrary. Okay? So by applying two sorts of negation, you have this result, and this result is a subalternation. So we have compatibility by means of two sorts of incompatible forming operators, contraction and contrary. The contrary of the contractory. Okay, so I have to be quick. So now imagine you want to apply this sort of semantics, but it's not a semantics because it has to do with the logical form statements. We don't talk about truth and falsity here. We just talk about negation and affirmation. I affirm a statement in which I say that I just have f or x. And I have a denial if I apply negation upon f or x, or both. Okay? So just imagine you have -1. -1 means that I apply protonegation to one component, or to whatever you want. And 1 is just the meaning of I affirm one component. Fx, I have 1, 1. F not x, 1 minus 1, etc. So it's nothing to do with truth and falsity once again. Okay? So it's just a possibility to have a sigma function. Sigma function, you map a logical form upon 1 or minus 1, you affirm or you deny. Minus 1, you deny, 1, you affirm. Okay? So you can say that the contradictory is just the case, the unique case in which you apply the negation upon the first term. Just negate the first component of the function. It's just a way to say that external negation has to do with contradiction. Now if you want to have contrariety, in this case subcontrary or contrariety, you apply negation upon one term within the structure of this component. We don't apply the negation upon f only, but maybe upon f and x or upon x. And in this case, don't have the same sort of information in the end, because of the different logical form between fx and f not x, for instance. Okay, different results. So according to the set of, it's just a way to simulate the different relation between information by means of the product between 1 and not 1, or not 1, etc. So now imagine you have more than just one function. You have not fx and f not x or not f. You have f, g, h, I, j, x. You have 4 different nested quantifiers. How to determine the meaning of, for instance, f, g, h of x and f not g, not h, not x. How to define exactly the oppositional relation between both, or maybe the implicational relation between both, by means of logical form once again. So here you have f1, f2, until fn. With n, it's just a natural integer, okay? So, this was the case in Buridan's model octagon. This was an octagon from the 12th century in which you have a model hierarchic derivatives. Here you have every man, necessary argues. Okay, you have one quantifier, f, necessary, j. And man argues are component of upon the binary sentence corresponding to the x argument. Okay? So it's possible, of course, to translate this into this one. Okay? So we have f, j, and x, quantifier, universal quantifier, box, and this conditional relation between m and a. So it's just one component. X is just one component. And here, Buridan doesn't apply negation separately to m and a. Negation is applied to the whole. Just that's quite. So this means that you have just 8 possible structural statements in this construction. Here, 8. You can have 16, but here it's just 8 because Buridan didn't apply negation to m and a separately. Okay, so you don't have this sort of relation. You have that one. Okay, so you have 8 different logical forms coming from the initial one, fjx, something like the basic logical form without a negation. And if you want to apply a negation here, you can apply a negation just upon the first term or the second one of both, etc. Okay, so you have different information. Now my question is, which sort of relation, for instance, do we have between 1 and 8? Are they compatible to each other or incompatible to each other, for instance? How to define this mechanically? This is a logical form according to Buridan, so it says like necessary, every man necessary argues. Okay? Not every man necessary argues, etc. There's a way to reconstruct Buridan's formulas by means of the classical apparatus. Here's a natural translation. Okay? Here are the squares. The squares by Engelbert said this squares has to do with epistemic oppositions. It's the case that I know that P. Okay? But as you can see here, we have exactly the same sort of relation, irrespective of the content. Here you have one operator, f, j, x, and f, j, x. So we have exactly the same sort of relations, same sort of oppositional relations, irrespective of the content, the meaning of f, j, and x. Because you have the same application of affirmation and denials to the different components of the structural segments with f, j, x form. Okay? Here is a cube in which you have the independent relations. So what's the meaning of independent? Semantically speaking, by means of true values, say these propositions can be true or false together. No constraint upon the true value assignment of these different statements. But here, I don't want to talk about truth and false statements. Okay? Yeah.
No, so okay. Running out of time.
Okay, so here are different relations. So the point is how to make sense of this one. how to make the difference between subalternation, contrariety, and independence. That's the limitation of the project here. So it's a way to define Engelbrechtsen's quaternary theory further by means of 8 different operators. It's not just NCD, it's C1, C2, C prime, because here you have different components. We don't have just fx structure, but fjx. fjxh will rise to 16, etc., etc. Okay? So now the question is how to. Yes. Okay, bye-bye. So here the conclusion general. So the three main things is that the meaning of a statement has to do with the logical form, because according to the logical form of the statement, they can say this is contradictory, or this is contrary, or something else. But the problem is that the truth conditional approach is limited, and structural semantics has been proposed as an alternative according to the logical form, but with limited results, of course. Because here, the three main results, opposition are obtained by negating logical form, by applying negation, proto-negation to x, f, or g, or whatever you want. And the structural operations do not lead to definite logical operations, because what's the meaning of independence? Does it mean something like a subcontrariety, or contrariety is not very clear? We cannot have a very specific definition of independence by means of this syntactic calculus. And the prospect, of course, is to afford the generative semantics, or maybe to assess the Boolean multiple string. Multiple strings, it's something like a conflation between the semantic approach and the syntactic approach. It's something to be close to be done in the future, but it's not the case for standing, and I have to end right now because I'm in a hurry. So sorry again, and thank you for your attention.
Then we'll have a quick commentary by Dariusz.
I will try to be brief. So I have two general issues and one specific. And I will start with the general one, namely, I would like to ask about the motivations for this research. I heard that you're looking for a procedure or algorithm for determining kind of oppositional relations between structured statements, based on the logical form of these statements, right? And I've read in other of your papers that you're looking also for something for an alternative to Tarski's consequence, whether these oppositional relations are something more fundamental or simply a general framework where you can reconstruct Tarski's consequence relation. And I'd like to ask whether some progress has been done and something you can say about it, because this is quite interesting. And I have also a specific question about, you formulate in your paper thesis 1, where you characterize different oppositional relations in terms of this sigma function. So if you have a statement of this form, and you apply this function to one element, this is one is unnegated and minus one is negated. Okay, so, and you have a definition of subalternation, which looks like f of x1 is subaltern. So G if I want to give different, this is simply an equality of statements. They're different, or
the relation between 1 and not 1, minus 1. So we have 1 and minus 1 in both cases.
This should be correct?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know whether I get it. I just want to see if I. So suppose we have something like that. So we have a structured statement, right, with existential quantifier. This would be f. This would be x1, okay? And let's put some negations here.
Yeah.
Like this. Like this. This is obviously equivalent to this. And if we calculate this expressions with sigma, so we have unnegated f, unnegated x1, so this would be 1, okay. Here we have a negated g on x2, so this would be minus 1, right?
Mm-hmm.
So one as well. So this expression is satisfied. Okay. And what do we have here? So let's see. What is the relation between phi and psi? So we have there is an x such that x is equal to is a, and all objects are a. Okay.
Yeah.
And according to this one, this also is satisfied because we have sigma f is 1,
Mm-hmm.
sigma g is minus 1, so sigma f is greater. And this equality is also satisfied because we have 2 on the left and minus 2 on the right.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah, yeah.
So it follows that phi is subaltern to psi, right? And I think this is not the case because just take a model with 2 elements, and this does not work. So I wonder where
Mm-hmm.
maybe some modification of this. We should consider something like that.
Yeah, so thank you for paying so much attention upon the calculus because it's very important, of course, as a result. So here, first of all, I have to explain that whenever you want to talk about the logical form of a statement, you need a basic logical form. In this case, a basic logical form in which you don't have any denial is a case in which you have a universal quantifier. What does it mean? If you have, for instance, there is an x such as x is a, in this case, this corresponds to a double application of denial. In which it's not the case that for every x, x is a, because of the very basic form. The basic form is for every x, x is a. So how to construct the meaning of for some x, x is a by means of the basic one, by applying denial twice. But the result is the same in the end, because by applying denial twice, it means that the product of minus 1 by minus 1 is 1, once again. But in this case, you have the other way around. It's not the subalternation relation, but the subaltern relation. So that's what does it mean? There is an x, so the x is a, is a subaltern of no, there is an x, so that x is a, is a subaltern of for every x, x is a, and x, for every x, x is a is a subalternation relation. Okay? So just here you have the other way around. I haven't defined this in this case. And second point, this does not mean that the value is the same. It's not a relation between 1 and minus 1. Sorry, I made a typo here. What does it mean here? We don't have the same logical form. It doesn't mean that we have 1 here and 1 there. It means that we don't have the logical form. For instance, fx1 is for every x, x is a. And here it's not for every x, x is not a. Okay, what does it mean? The logical forms are the same. So here, it means that fx1, jx2 don't have the same logical form. But they have the same value, because they have, for instance, minus 1 times minus 1 equals 1 by 1. What does it mean? It means that we have a subaltern relation between for every x is a, and for some x is a because of the double application of -1. That's the point. About the, thanks for your point. And about the first question, what's the relevance of having an oppositional operator? My point was, in the beginning I said there was two different sorts of information. We can say, for instance, define information in terms of consequence. Given the truth of P, what can I deduce from P, for instance? It has to do with in epistemic logic or a dynamic epistemic logic, you can deduce a set of information from the first one. So in this case, we have information in terms of consequence. No meaning of opposition. As I explained at the beginning of the paper, of the program, I say you can make a difference between contrariety and contradiction, for instance, because contrariety is not a set of information. If you say, I just want to say to know what is consistent and inconsistent with the proposition I assume to be true. In this case, you can content with a very basic operator of consequence, because for you, your theory of action is just based upon one operator of consequence. And consequence is sufficient in order to be relevant. Now, if you want to have a richer set of informations by means of oppositional structures or implicational structures, you can construct another operator which happens to be able to simulate subordination in one sense. Just that. You say OP. OP is just a structural operator, okay? And here is CN. CN, for instance, you say CN is the relation between different sets of formulas. Set of statements, okay, CN is just a Tarski's operator. Now the question is, can you construct another sort of operator such that we have an oppositional relation between alpha and psi? Okay? In a sense, yes, because just imagine, for instance, what's the relation between P and Q and P or Q? You can say that this is a subaltern of P and Q. Okay? There is a subordination relation here, between here and there. And at the same time, you can say that this is the logical consequence of P and Q. So if you accept a very limited definition of consequence in terms of a classical consequence, you can say that subordination is to be defined in this what's it again? So say okay? So here a functional definition of subordination. So long as you accept the meaning according to which subordination has to do with consequence, in this case you can say that you can somehow simulate the consequence relation in terms of oppositional relations, because CD and CT are functional operators within the set of oppositional operations. Okay? Now the question is, can we simulate absolutely every sort of consequence by means of this one? It's just a classical view of consequence. Of course, if you want to go further, problems arise. And it's something to be done. It's something at work. That's the point.
Okay, thank you. Then we have a quick commentary by Jester.
Okay. Okay, so again, this is fairly general actually, so I apologize, but that probably shows more my interests than the papers in some ways. But I find the paper really intriguing, the entire program really important. So okay, like I wondered how this fits essentially with fairly traditional debates about negation. Particularly the way that you mentioned proto-negation, and I wondered, this terminology of proto-negation suggests that maybe there is a real negation operator, proto-negation operators which are structurally compounded or combined. And at one point in the paper you say that contradiction is the only negation which can be applied to single structural statements. Right? So I wondered, so is contradiction the true negation in this sense? Yeah. So in a sense, how does this work in relation to, for example, Slater's objection against apparent consistency, that the subcontrariety operator is not a negation? Because obviously, like for Slater, he's coming at this from the point of view of truth, right? Which already kind of weighs the table in his favor, I think. Whereas you're trying to do this from the point of view of syntax, logical form, which I think is far more interesting. And it has maybe then it has a relation to the other debates in work like Smiley and Mumford and Price, where what they're doing is saying, well, so we don't want to start off with truth because this kind of skews what negation can be, because our theory of truth is already kind of written in. to the definition of negation, and they have this argument against the Frege definition of denial as a negation of assertion. So they have assertion and denial as kind of equally important relations, and then you define negation secondarily, right, in relation to those. And I like this story a lot. I think there's probably some sort of consonance with what we're saying. I'm not just interested in what it is, I guess, because one of the things that I'm thinking about this is that if you buy their story, even if you buy their story that you need both assertion and denial and then build up negation out of that, it's hard to get sort of contrariety. It's easy to get contrariety because say you start off with a relation where it looks like assertion and denial of the same thing at the same time is incompatible, right? So unless you get rid of that, in which case you have it looks like you have an irreflexive relationship between the two, in which case so the assertion and denial of A can't happen together. Right? So it's easy to get contrariety, it's more difficult to get sort of contrariety out of the other end of the story, I think. I heard other stuff on there, but I don't want to go on for too long. And then the other thing is really related to this question about consequence. So the relationship between the opposition relationship and the consequences. A couple of things I just found interesting. One is this I think has a wider implication for how we understand the role of logic, in terms of the options being it's logic about logical truth, is it about correct reasoning, does it have no connection with reasoning at all, like Gilbert Harman thinks. There seems to be a nice link between what you're doing and a kind of far more expansive understanding of logic through this sort of pragmatic tradition, I suppose. It seems like it's probably a nice link between this and what Random's doing in the game of giving and asking for reasons, but far more interesting because incompatibility is essentially classical random, so you end up with straightforward with S5. Okay, and then the other thing is, I'm going on for too long, so I thought maybe you could look at formulating consequence, kind of like Tarski does in terms of closure, but in terms of an inclusion relationship. But then I think I don't know, there's an interesting relevance between this and the asymmetry that you're going to get between the more fine-grained structure, which then I think maybe, I don't know, maybe then you've got this, I'm just going to speed up here, so I'm not going to say this, but it's an interesting link between then what you're doing, which I think is possibly a nice argument against the Susskill reduction and against Béziar's reduction by valence. It looks like you're gonna have a serious loss of expressivity if you perform those reductions. Whereas perhaps it's kind of like what Wansing argues that it's possible to construct the way around it against. All right, so, this is argument against so the Susskill reduction, and then I think this guy Tsuji or something argues that within the universal logic framework, in Béziar's framework, you're going to lose out on reflexivity, and then Wansing suggests, well, you need more entailment relationships for each inferential value, and then you can get reflexivity for each relation, right, but they may be separate. So yeah, okay, I'm just asking you, can we construct then multiple consequence relationships which maintain this, maybe something like an inclusion relation of structures of opposition? Right. I don't know if this makes sense. Does it make sense?
It does, according to me, so I have to be very sketchy. So how to summarize? Well, the point is that what is exactly the contribution of negation to meaning in general? Yeah. So how to make sense of negation, because I have a constructive approach to semantics. You have a logical form, you have information. Now if you want to negate this information, to what extent can we say that this new information with negation is different from the first one? So the difference between both informations needn't entail incompatibility relation. Of course, we can have two different relations, two different propositions being compatible with each other. Okay. My question was how to determine exactly the sort of relation between both propositions by means of a very general approach of negation, in which it's a so-called proto-negation, irrespective of the truth and falsity, just according to the logical form of the statements. And you mentioned paraconsistent negation. Paraconsistent can be simulated by means of the S5 model operator, just as intrinsic negation can be simulated by means of the S4 model operator, by means of Gödel in 33. And the question is that in both cases, you apply negation, because the way to simulate the paraconstant negation is to apply the negation internally, not externally. It's just a way to simulate paraconstant negation. I don't want to say that this logical, syntactic approach of paraconstant approach is exhaustive. It's not the case. Just a way to simulate one fragment of paraconstant logic. Okay, exactly as for intrinsic logic. But if I want to apply this negation in this case, it's a proto-negation, just because it has to be absolutely made different from the classical negation. This negation doesn't mean something like changes the true value. Nothing to do with true value, just something to do with the change of information. You have something different between two different propositions. So how are they different from each other? They can be different from different respects. You have two different ways of defining difference, by means of consequence or by means of different in the very general sense. And the theory of propositions I'm interested in is a way to make sense of this sort of different relation between propositions.
Okay,
so thanks for your questions.
I think it makes sense only to accept questions if they are short and they are bound to have one sentence long answers, given the timing issues. And yes, dear.
Brief informative question. Do you presuppose when you write propositional letters, for example, that these are independent in meaning?
Which ones? Which proposition?
Propositional letters.
Lattice.
Like you say P
Letters.
and Q.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you suppose that P and Q are independent of each other, logically speaking?
The problem is to define exactly the logical form of P and Q. So do we have something common in the logical form or not? P and Q are supposed to have different logical forms. In this case, the semantics assumes that we can define the relation between different propositions if they have the same basic logical form. And P and Q are supposed not to have the same logical form. So how to apply my program in this case? It's not very clear. But according to the logical form of propositions, you can say that two different meanings, two different statements with one the same logical form at the beginning can be independent from each other too. But with respect to the question between P and Q, I cannot say anything here once I'm not able to say what is their basic logical form together, because there is no syntactic something.
So the answer was yes.
Yes, but answer.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thanks.
And the launch is available in the registration room. The initial plan was to go to a park, but the weather does not permit it, so we'll just have to hang out here. Do you want to go to the park then?
What do you mean the weather does not permit? You are afraid of rain, you mean?
kind of block are they using for the screen? Or did you upload your slides here or what?
Well, Rafal said I could plug my computer in, which is what I would prefer to do.
Alright, looks like maybe that one. Alright.
Yeah, I'm not actually sure how to activate it though.